Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We are going to get into our psych video today to start talking about thinking and things like being creative and cognition. So let's go ahead and get right to it. So as I mentioned, we are done with our portion of this unit on memory now. So good job, pat yourself on the back. We are done with that portion, and we are now moving on to the portion that is cognition in Unit 5, and that has to do with thinking, creativity, language, all of those kinds of things. So that is where we're going now. This module is short and sweet, just a couple quick things we need to talk about. Just two main terms here, like cognition and creativity. But let's go ahead and get right into it. So what exactly is cognition? Hopefully you have heard this word a lot at this point in our course. Cognition is any mental activity associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. So that's why this entire unit, Unit 5, is titled Cognitive Psychology, because obviously where we say remembering, we talked about memory. Now we're talking about thinking, and then we're going to be talking about language and everything too. So I always just think cognition is thinking. Easiest way to remember that. All right, so one thing that we need to talk about with, in terms of how we kind of organize thoughts in our mind, is concepts. So concepts are mental groupings of similar objects, events, ideas, or people. So for example, this little cartoon over here says, "Attention everyone, I'd like to introduce the newest member of our family." And these are all different kinds of chairs over here. So this concept would be, these are all chairs. These are what chairs look like and everything. And then you group them all together because they all generally have a similar thing where they have 4 legs, they have a seat, they have a back, something like that. So you group all those similar objects together. So that would be like a concept of a chair. Further, with a concept, we also tend to have a prototype in our mind, which is a mental image or best example of a category. So it's kind of like when you think about a concept or category, like when you think of a chair, real quick, close your eyes, boom, chair. What did you see? Whatever you saw is your prototype for chair. And very likely it probably looked like something like this, where again, it's just got the 4 legs, maybe like a wooden seat and a wooden back. You might not necessarily think of like a big, cozy, comfy chair. That might not be your prototype. That's still something that's within your concept of what a chair looks like. But this is probably something you've been exposed to most as what you may consider your prototype. So it's just basically, what is your best example of whatever it is in that category? So go ahead and think for a second. If you are thinking about the concept of a bird, can you name a bunch of different types of birds and maybe some things in terms of, okay, probably has wings, it can fly, it has a beak. So then maybe you go through including all of these different types of birds. That's your concept. Now with prototype, the best way to think of it is, what's the best example of a bird? What is the birdiest bird? So for example, a penguin, that technically falls within the concept of bird. It is a bird. However, penguin is definitely not the thing that I think of right away when I think of a bird, because, you know, penguins can't fly. They're not, they're like much larger. They're just not what I would think of when I think of bird. So for me, a prototype might be something like maybe like an eagle or something, or a hawk maybe, just because, I don't know, for me, that's what it is, what I think of. But maybe this changes if you live in New York City, where a certain type of bird is more popular, or in Miami, Florida, where again, might be a different type of bird that's more popular there. Also, maybe something that comes to mind here is an oriole, because that is kind of the state bird of Maryland. So maybe that's something that pops in your mind for your prototype for a bird. So this quick question here, when asked to think of a dog, many people think of a golden retriever. So in this case, a golden retriever is people's what for a dog? If you narrow down your choices to what are the 2 things we just talked about, prototype and concept, just thinking a golden retriever as your main example for the category of dogs, that would be a prototype. All right, so those two are pretty simple and straightforward. And so we do then have to match new items to a prototype. That way we can then figure out what's the category I need to store these things in. So basically, whenever we have some new incoming kind of information, you match it to your prototype and think, which category does this best fall into? Something else I just thought of too is, for example, my prototype of a phone is, I would think of like a handheld phone kind of thing where it has the big speaker on the top and the part where you speak in on the bottom. That might not be the same prototype for all of you who maybe have not really had those kinds of handheld phones or phones with the cords or anything growing up. I wonder if something like this, an iPhone, is your prototype for a phone. So concepts are just things to kind of help us understand our world. There's so many different things all the time in the environment. So we just need to find ways in our mind to simplify it all by categorizing things. So we do categorize people, and obviously to a certain extent, that's when you could get into stereotyping and everything. So you have to be very careful with this. But on a very basic level, categorizing people just helps us to be able to kind of mentally, again, kind of like group these different things, all the different people that you encounter on a daily basis. Maybe not so much right now, but usually all the different people you might encounter, it just kind of helps to categorize in your brain. But again, you can't go too far with that. So this example here has to do with a research study that shows when Belgian students viewed a blended face in which 70% of the features were Caucasian or white and 30% were Asian, the students categorized the face as Caucasian. So basically when they were shown this face right here, even though it technically has some features of an Asian face mixed in with it, people would categorize this as Caucasian because it best fits that category in their mind, that concept. However, if they were shown a 70% Asian face with a 30% Caucasian mixed in, so this one right here, the students later remembered a more prototypically Asian face. So obviously there's just these two different faces here on this end. This is the almost fully Caucasian face, almost fully Asian face, and then they just kind of mix them together. So you do kind of put it into a specific concept or prototype that matches best for you. It's kind of interesting to think about these in terms of which category or concept would you put these items into. Is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? I feel like a lot of us instantly think, oh, a tomato is a vegetable, obviously, but it's actually a fruit. So it is kind of interesting how we've kind of maybe mislabeled this one in our grouping of concepts. Is a whale a fish or a mammal? It lives in the water, so it must be a fish. Actually, whales are mammals. So similar things like that. Is a 16-year-old female a girl or a woman? That depends on your own definition of how you want to figure that out, and could be based on a cultural definition of what categorizes when you are officially a woman. Is it like you have a specific party, like a sweet 16, or is it when you have a quinceañera when you're 15? It depends kind of on exactly what your culture decides on. So what then happens if events, people, or items don't match our prototypes? If sometimes that can cause problems, because if a doctor is looking at symptoms of a person and the symptoms don't really fit into any of the prototypes for diseases they know about, like know very well, then you might be kind of slower to perceive an illness. That also goes then for yourself too. If you're like, these things like don't really fit in with anything, so I must be fine. But you might actually have some kind of symptoms of a disease. Also with a heart attack, a lot of people have the prototype of that's when you have a really sharp pain in your chest. However, there are other symptoms of a heart attack like shortness of breath, exhaustion, and a dull weight in the chest. So a lot of people might have those other symptoms, but it doesn't match their prototype for heart attack, and therefore they might not seek help, which can obviously be very dangerous. And also when behaviors don't fit our discrimination prototypes of, we usually think it might be like white people discriminating against Black people, males discriminating against females, young people discriminating against old, we often fail to notice the prejudice. So it might be someone who is older discriminating against a younger person. We might be like, no, there's nothing wrong with what they just said or anything, because that doesn't fit our prototype of discrimination between ages. If a female does something that is discriminating against a male, same thing. It's like, well, that's not really how discrimination works with gender. It's usually male discriminating against female, so we don't really notice it as much, when it very well may be an instance of discrimination, of female discriminating against male. Okay, so now let's talk about creativity and different kinds of thinking. So creativity is the ability to produce new or novel and valuable, useful ideas. So I'm sure, obviously, you have heard of creativity many times in your life, and you kind of have your own general definition for it. You do want to make sure you know this exact like psychology definition. It's probably similar to what you know of, but this is kind of the wording that we have for it in psychology: the ability to produce new or novel and valuable, useful ideas. So we have two different kinds of thinking. We have convergent thinking and divergent thinking. So with convergent thinking, that is when you narrow the available problem solutions to determine the single best solution. So basically, there's a bunch of different solutions out here to a problem, and then you got to hone in on, okay, so what are we actually going to pick as our solution here? That is convergent. So it's all the things, all the different ideas coming together into one solution. Divergent thinking is the opposite of that. So it's, all right, we've got a problem. Let's try to think of as many possible solutions as we possibly can. It's also known as brainstorming. So it's, okay, I need to figure out how I can make sure I get better sleep at night. Let's brainstorm all the different possible ways that I could potentially do that, of going to bed earlier, having a good wind down routine, making sure that I exercise earlier in the day, things like that. So I kind of like to picture both of these as some kind of like branching thing. So with convergent, it's here's all my big branches, and then it goes down into one root. And then with divergent, it's the opposite. We start with one kind of root thing and then go into all these different branches here. That's just kind of a mental picture that I have. So if you think of some examples of convergent and divergent thinking, convergent thinking could be like an aptitude test, like the SAT, which means they give you a bunch of different potential solutions and you have to find the correct one amongst them. So a bunch of options, you have to narrow it down to one. Divergent thinking would be like a creativity test. So how many uses can you think of for a brick? So you have like one concept here, and then you go in a bunch of different directions to be able to think in new and different ways. So it's kind of fun if you want to practice this yourself, and we'll come back to this kind of a little bit later on. How many uses can you create for a paper cup? How many different ways can you use a brick? It's just kind of interesting to let your mind roam and think about those things. So according to Robert Sternberg, we have 5 main components of creativity, and those involve expertise, imaginative thinking skills, a venturesome personality, intrinsic motivation, and a creative environment. We're going to talk about these top 3 up here, but intrinsic motivation we will cover in a couple of modules from now, but that just basically means you are motivated to do something within yourself. There's no external reward. You do it just because you want to do it. That's intrinsic motivation. A creative environment is just, obviously you have lots of different outlets that could help you to think more creatively. You're not kind of boxed into a small space kind of thing. So thinking about a venturesome personality, that is someone who seeks new experiences, tolerates ambiguity and risk, and perseveres in overcoming obstacles. So this example over here says, Princeton mathematician Andrew Wiles pondered for more than 30 years a mathematical puzzle left by Pierre de Fermat, a 17th century mischievous mathematical genius. Wiles said he labored in near isolation from the mathematics community, partly to stay focused and avoid distraction. So Andrew Wiles would be an example of someone who probably doesn't have a very venturesome personality. He kind of shut himself in, and that's why it probably took him so long to think through this problem. Whereas if he went out in the world and everything and was getting new experiences, all those things kind of come together to help you then be more creative and be able to think better. So it's really good to have lots of different experiences. Imaginative thinking, this is something we very often see with cartoonists because it's just a way to make unusual connections, think in new ways. I think you probably know what imaginative thinking is. Are you thinking of SpongeBob right now with imagination? That's what went through my head. Some ways that you can boost your creativity are developing your expertise, meaning becoming really good at something. So take the time to learn the skills and become good at it. Allow time for incubation, which means you do need to think really hard about something sometimes, but then you also need to walk away and then come back to it. Because, like I said, going outside of the box and getting new experiences and everything, those things kind of free up your mind to then be able to think back to the original solution. Set aside time for the mind to roam freely. So this is really interesting because I've seen a lot of research that shows over time as like humans, we are kind of becoming less creative in some ways because there is something that we very often turn to whenever we have some downtime. What might that be? Your phone. If you are like waiting to go to a doctor's appointment, for example, and you're sitting in the waiting room, before we had phones, you would probably just sit there and wait, or maybe you read a magazine or something like that. But when you're just sitting there, you have time to daydream. And daydream is something that really helps your creativity. Your mind can just kind of roam wherever it wants and be imaginative. So whenever we take those moments of kind of when we don't have something to do and we fill it with going on our phone right away, that might then kind of limit your ability to be as creative because you're not allowing your mind that time to freely roam. So I do encourage you to sometimes if you're doing something, you're waiting on someone or whatever, to just put your phone aside and let your mind wander, see what it can do. And then also experiencing other cultures and ways of thinking that absolutely helps boost creativity if you have lots of different kinds of experiences. So what would you answer here? Mental activities associated with remembering, thinking, and knowing are called what? That would be A, cognition. That is what cognition is. All right, so like I said, short and sweet, there we go. You know about cognition, concepts, and prototypes. Creativity, we talked about convergent and divergent thinking. Also, one last thing that I remember with Divergent is if you ever read or watched the movies of Divergent, think of how they're all into different factions, how there's like a bunch of different, like everyone is people, but then they're broken into different like sectors. That's how you can also think of Divergent, of kind of going to a bunch of different directions. So that's just something that comes to mind for me too. All right, so that is it. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and we will see you in class.